This is very, very relevant to me, and I think very relevant to the whole argument, and unfortunately, again, most never think about this subject at all. In order for us to consider routes of social change, we must also have a clear understanding of conditioning, our biology, and our relationship to the environment. As denoted before, when it comes to the pursuits of social change, the most profound hurdle is overcoming the traditional ideology, identifications, and dogmas which have been set in stone as final by the established culture. Of these ideas, a consistent one that comes up has to do with the conclusion that the human being is of a rigid, fixed nature, whereas certain behaviors are simply immutable. Therefore, as the logic goes, social structures are locked into a set pattern, which cannot be overcome due to the very nature of the species. In order to address this claim, we need to first consider the ramifications of culture itself. The word culture in a social sense is defined as a set of shared attributes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution, organization, or group. The most obvious, yet often overlooked example of the mechanics of culture is the fact that we are provably shaped by the sort of society we live in. The language you use, the gaming strategies you execute for survival, the perception of beauty you lust for, the familial patterns and traditions you perpetuate, and the deeply held theology, myths, and urban legends that define your broadest view are all examples of the qualities you might absorb arbitrarily from the culture you have been born into. In fact, if you dig deeper, you find that there is really nothing that we cognitively think and believe which isn't first presented to us in some environmental form. An insulted man who pulls out a gun and shoots somebody had to learn at some point in his life what a gun was, how to pull the trigger, along with what he was defined insulting to begin with. Every word that I am saying has been learned one way or another. Every concept relayed is a collective accumulation of experience. A Chinese baby taken at birth and raised in a British family in England will develop the language, dialect, mannerisms, traditions, and accent of the British culture. Needless to say, it is obvious the profound effect the environment has on behavior. But that's only part of the equation, for we are obviously biologically defined as well. It doesn't matter how much time I try to condition a cat to learn to speak English, it simply can't. Simply due to the limitations of its evolutionarily derived biological state. Those limitations are basically defined by genes. Genes are a fairly recent discovery, and there has been a great deal of speculation as to the spectrum that genes hold. Spectrum of relevance that genes hold. The most contentious is in the realm of behavioral biology. This is a field dedicated to understanding how genetics influences behavior. The idea that genetics are the possible source of various behaviors became popular in about the 19th century. One of the first pursuits that emerged was the idea that the aberrancies of human behavior, such as criminality, could be explained by a person's genes. You know, the old criminal gene idea. Sickly enough, even eugenics operations in the form of sterilization took place many years ago in an attempt to rid society of, quote, criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. The implication is that certain people are naturally, quote, bad people due to their genetics. You see this rhetoric everywhere. Someone might say, he has bad blood, or she's just an evil person. As an aside, I find it fascinating that this simplistic social fallback to explain a person's behavior is in full accord with the primitive superstitious duality postulated by nearly all established religions, good and evil. The gene in this case has replaced the satanic demon that once possessed a person, and thus the person has no control over their evil actions. In other words, they are slaves to their genes. Well, as research has progressed, it has been found that genes do nothing of the sort. Genes are stretches of DNA that produce proteins, which of course are vital to the operation of the brain, the nervous system, and the whole body. However, they are not autonomous initiators of commands. They do not cause behaviors in any real sense of the idea. In the words of Professor of Biology and Neurology at Stanford University, and a well-known anthropologist as well, Dr. Robert Sapolsky, Genes are rarely about inevitability, especially when it comes to humans, the brain, and behavior. They're about vulnerability, propensities, and tendencies. As it turns out, the determining factor of genetic propensities, particularly in the realm of behavior, is the environment that the organism resides in. For example, recent research has shown that a gene could exist for depression. However, just because you have that gene does not mean you're going to get depressed. It takes some form of dramatic environmental stressor to trigger the genetic response, such as a sudden death of a loved one or something very severe. In other words, the environment triggers the existing genetic propensity. Even with a genetic predisposition to a particular illness, there's no guarantee you're going to get it. A chair with a broken leg is not dangerous if you never sit on it. As a variation of this, it is interesting to know how the environment even affects broad physiological attributes, a realm traditionally left for the genetic side of the nature and nurture debate. A study was done a few years ago at the Miami School of Medicine with premature infants in neonatology wards, where they decided to simply touch a section of the infants in the wards a few times a day, while the other section was not touched. All feeding patterns remained alike, everything else equal. As it turned out, the infants that were touched grew 50% faster and were noticeably more healthy. They were released from the hospital a week early. When compared months later, these same kids showed better health and agility than those that were not touched. It's incredible. It's a dramatic finding on many levels, for it shows that the genetically prescribed growth hormone release can be profoundly influenced by a simple and subtle environmental experience. Furthermore, the environment can not only trigger genetic propensities or influence their extent, it can override them to a certain degree. A couple of years ago, another study was done at Princeton University where scientists were able to genetically engineer mice, removing a key gene relevant to their neurotransmitter system, selectively targeting learning and memory. As a result, the cultivated mice report various memory and learning exercises. They had trouble recognizing simple objects, their accuracy of smell was poor, and they were unable to learn well in many ways, which otherwise would be normal to an average mouse. Once their disability was confirmed and established, the scientists then put the cognitively dim mice as adults in an enriched, stimulating environment. And over time, it was found that many of the genetically engineered learning disabilities were actually overcome by the simple exposure to an intellectually nurturing environment. In other words, the environment is actually able to reestablish neurological pathways that seemed not to exist. Again, this is a powerful testament of the power of the environment when it comes to brain and hence behavior. We're perpetually molded and shaped by what's around us, and it has an extremely direct effect on our genes and what might be inherent to us. It's very important. The reason this is being brought up is to illustrate the fact that our environment is provably the most important determinant in our functionality. Nurture, in many ways, dictates nature on many levels, ranging from behavior to to physiology. Psychology would have relevance, but to physiology and health. Consequently, it is incorrect to think that the human being is a slave to his biology, especially when it comes to his or her actions. This is a powerful myth which needs to be dispelled and debunked. For when we realize the importance of our environment, we'll be much more prone to changing it, and that's why I'm talking about this. In isolation, it might seem like these are abstractions, but we have to learn that biologically, we are only as relevant, so to speak, as the environment which interacts with our biology. However, as one final example worth considering, which from my perspective summarizes the overwhelming power and relevance of our environmental culture we are exposed to, let's consider the implications of feral children. A feral child is a human child which has lived isolated from human contact from a very young age.